Ladies and gentlemen, fellow delegates, summiteers, the moment we've all been waiting for, the closing of the 21st Annual Summit. We have a distinct pleasure to welcome as our closing keynote speaker, Mr. John Elkann, who happens to be, if you don't know, the chairman of the Fiat Group, where he has served as vice chairman since 2004 and a board member since '97. He's also chairman of Exor, which is the investment company controlled by his family, and he is well educated and a delightful man. I'm not going to read his whole biography. You can Wikipedia him, you can YouTube him, you can do all of that if you like. But in the interest of time and hearing his thoughts, his story, and learning from his family history and experience, I'm going to ask him to the stage now.
Good evening to all of you. I want to thank the FBN for having me here and its chairman, Thierry Lombard. It is a great honor to be here with you, and I will be speaking about my experience and how we've been keeping our family business vibrant for generations. It basically all started in 1899 with the foundation of Fiat from a group of partners from Torino, of which my great-grandfather, Giovanni Agnelli. He was then in his mid-30s and had been an officer, a military officer. His family had land, so what he had done was, after a career as a military, develop the land both in real estate projects and also in farm projects. But he didn't get that excited about that, so in times where in Italy the Industrial Revolution was starting and many people were setting up business, he decided to start with new partners of his, a carb company, of which many were founded back then in Italy. He was really the driving force within the development of Fiat during those years. And he truly believed in mass production to try and take the cost down of cars and be able to sell cars to as many people as possible. He was a great believer in the United States, came often here in America, often to Detroit, where he went and visited the Big Three and had a very strong relationship with Henry Ford. He basically developed Fiat into one of the leading industrial firms in Italy and one of the leading car manufacturers in Europe. And in the late 20s, he basically decided to do three things. First, he started giving more operational control of the businesses to non-family executives. And so he appointed a CEO. He also decided to have all his interests, of which Fiat and other investments, which were very diversified for the period. He owned land doing cotton in Egypt, real estate in the US, a liquor company called Cinzano, and other interests, in a holding company, which he founded in 1927. He had lost his 2 children by then and had 12 grandchildren. So he wanted his grandchildren to all be owners of his interests without having to split between themselves the actual underlying assets. And the third thing he did was that he chose between his 12 grandchildren, my grandfather, Giovanni Agnelli, as his successor, because he felt, though he wasn't his eldest grandson or granddaughter, he felt that he was the one who had most potential to keep his family and the business together. My grandfather, when the war ended in 1945, found himself at the age of 24 with basically no parents, no grandparents, and with his siblings and his cousins in charge of a very important industrial group. And in those very difficult moments where basically everything was destroyed, he took two important decisions. The first one was that all his family decided to support and back the reconstruction of Fiat and the other businesses, which were destroyed by the war. And so they firmly committed and invested in their businesses. And second decision is that he kept the executives that had worked with his grandfather. So he kept Vittorio Valletta as CEO of Fiat, and also Vola, who was CEO of IFI, who was the holding company. And those were incredible years in Europe and in Italy, the famous Miracolo Economico. Everything was being rebuilt. There was a lot of optimism. There was a lot of growth. And he experienced that period where under Valletta's leadership, Fiat became a very profitable company and a very large organization. And in 1966, he became chairman of Fiat, succeeding Vittorio Valletta. And Fiat then was a company where everything seemed to work very well. And the next decade, he really found himself in a terrible situation. There were two major crises with the oil shocks. Italy was a country where you had a lot of instability. You had terrorism. Many people who were working in Fiat got killed. And it was a very difficult moment in relationships with labor. And during those years, he committed his time, capital, to the business. He was, at that point, chairman of Confindustria, which was the union of all industrialists in Italy, dedicating his time to try and see how things could evolve. And all of that period ended in 1981, when 40,000 people working in Fiat, mainly white collars, basically went on a spontaneous manifestation. And at that moment, really things changed within Fiat and within the country. And the next decade was a very positive decade for Fiat and also in general for our business activities, where we expanded in other business and in other sectors. My personal experience with the family business, and I was born in 1976, hadn't been that big, in the sense that I come from a very big family. My mother had 3 children from a first marriage, 5 from another marriage. I was born here in America, New York. We lived in the UK, we lived in Brazil, we lived in France. So I had great education all around the world, but actually not in Italy. And so when I was 18 and I had to decide where to study, I chose to go to Italy. My father and my mother are both from Italy, so I felt that it was important for me to know my country, know my roots, and so I decided to study engineering. And I arrived in Turin in '94, and at that point I started being much more in contact with my grandfather, with whom I spent a substantial amount of time then, not only going to vacations, seeing exhibitions or sports events, but also getting to know more about the business. And so while I was at college, I basically started also working, and I do internship within Fiat in manufacturing, in commercial operations, in administration, accounting, finance, which I had no idea what they were as I was studying engineering. And in that period, in '97, my older cousin, who was in his early 30s, died of a rare form of cancer. And my grandfather asked me to join the board of Fiat. And I was 21 years old, which was really the same age he had when he joined Fiat board, when his grandfather had asked him. And since then, I've started to be much more involved within our family business. That decade was a very difficult decade. And we experienced during that period a lot of problems. My grandfather started not being well and had a very difficult cancer. The business was doing poorly and started to do very, very bad. And in 2003, when my grandfather passed away, we were really in a scenario where everything was not working. And you would really feel a sensation of agony everywhere. And during that period, during the funeral of my grandfather, and he used to say that funerals were not really done for people who leave, but for people who stay, because in his experience, his father had had a big funeral while his grandfather had had a very small funeral. In his case, there's been a huge demonstration to him, and so thousands of people came to say goodbye to him. And at that moment, for my family, was a wake-up call. And at that same instant, we decided that we had to react in this situation. And so under the leadership of my great-uncle, my grandfather's brother, as a family, we basically recapitalized with money we all had in other ventures to do a capital increase in Fiat and be able to go forward with a plan and a turnaround plan.